It is 1970. The air inside the Long Beach Arena doesn't feel like it belongs to a casual Saturday afternoon. It feels heavy, charged, and electric, thick with the scent of floor wax, sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of nervous anticipation. If you were standing there, you would feel it in the soles of your feet before you even saw it. 3,000 people, a sea of faces packing the stands, stretching all the way back to the cold concrete of the far wall. This wasn't just a gathering of fight fans, it was the epicenter of a culture, the International Karate Championships, the kind of stage where reputations were built in the span of a single afternoon, and where the hierarchy of the American martial arts scene was being decided in real time. For nearly a decade, this place had been a crucible. It was where the names that mattered, the legends in the making, the men who lived by the code of the black belt, came to prove their worth. The noise of the crowd was a constant low-frequency hum, a mixture of casual conversation, the shouting of coaches, and the rhythmic, slapping sound of bare feet against the mat, a sound that, to the trained ear, is as distinct as a heartbeat. It was a place defined by unwritten rules. Bow when you enter, respect the black belt, follow the protocol, and keep your composure. That was the law of the land. But amidst that sea of organized, ritualized aggression, sitting in the third row was a man who looked like he had wandered in from a different reality entirely. Bruce Lee. He wasn't sitting there with the puffed-up chest of a competitor or the aggressive slouch of a fighter looking for a scrap. He was wearing a dark jacket, simple and understated, paired with black trousers. His hands were resting quietly on his knees. That's it. No theatrics, no aggressive posturing, no attempt to draw the eye. Yet, if you looked closely at the room, you would notice something peculiar. The energy of the arena seemed to bend around him. At 30 years old, Bruce was a name that had been circulating through the Los Angeles martial arts underground like a secret. It wasn't the kind of fame that came from billboards or magazine covers. It was the kind of reputation that traveled through whispers and hushed conversations in gym corners. People spoke his name with a mix of curiosity and confusion because nobody could quite pin him down. Was he a fighter? Was he a philosopher? Was he a stuntman? Was he something else entirely? He didn't fit into the boxes that the karate world had built for itself. He was a variable that the equation couldn't solve. Every time his name was announced, the applause that rose from the crowd was different. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic clapping you give a local favorite. It was a wave of recognition, a collective acknowledgement that they were looking at someone who didn't play by the standard rules. Bruce would offer a single, sharp nod, a small, efficient movement, and then settle back into that stillness. He was a master of presence. While everyone else around him was projecting their intensity, Bruce was containing his. He was like the eye of a hurricane, the only point of calm in an arena that was destined to explode. He sat there watching the tournament unfold with a gaze that was disturbingly observant. He wasn't just watching the techniques, he was analyzing the gaps, the hesitations, the flaws in the armor of men who were considered the best in the business. And the people around him, the 3,000 souls in that arena, didn't know it yet, but they were sitting on a fault line. They had no idea that they were about to witness a moment that would fracture the history of martial arts. They didn't know that the outcome of this tournament, the victory that was supposed to be celebrated with flowers and trophies, would serve as a fuse for an event that would change the trajectory of an entire generation of fighters. The tension was mounting, not because of anything happening on the mat, but because of the pressure in the room. You can feel it when a story is about to shift from a sports event into something historical. It starts with the air growing thin. It starts when the chatter in the seats begins to die down because something in the periphery of your vision feels off. That's the mood I'm describing, the stillness before the chaos. The way the light caught the dust motes in the arena, the way the silence felt heavy right before the bell rang. It was the silence of a packed room that intuitively knows it is about to stop being a spectator and start being a witness. Bruce didn't look like he was waiting for anything. He was just being. He was existing in a space that others were trying to dominate. While the fighters on the floor were busy proving themselves to the judges, to the crowd, and to each other, Bruce had already reached a place where he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That was his power. And it was that very power, that quiet, unbothered confidence, that was about to drive his challenger to the edge. The storm was coming, brought in by a young man who was undefeated, arrogant, and hungry. But for this brief, frozen moment, all we had was the stillness of the third row and the mounting, suffocating weight of 3,000 people, waiting for a bell that would change everything. The setup was perfect, the stage was set, and the quiet was about to be shattered in a way that would echo for decades. Arrogance in the face of greatness. The silence of the arena didn't last. It was torn apart by the arrival of a force that seemed entirely too big for the room. While Bruce sat in the third row, calm and contained, the focus of the arena shifted violently toward the center of the mat. Out walked the man who would define the chaos. He was 22 years old, standing at a towering 6'5", and weighing in at a solid 245 pounds of pure, unchecked momentum. He was the reigning European champion, a product of the full-contact world, and from the moment he stepped onto the floor, he carried an air of absolute, unearned certainty. This young man wasn't just here to win a trophy, he was here to validate a worldview. He had been trained since he was 13 and lifting since he was 15, built like a fortress that had never been tested by anything it couldn't simply crush. When you are that young, that strong, and that undefeated, you tend to develop a dangerous blind spot. You begin to believe that your strength is the only truth, that if something doesn't bow to your power, it must be flawed. He didn't know that he was about to collide with a version of reality he hadn't even imagined existed. The tournament bracket had been his playground all day. He moved through the competition not like a participant, but like a storm tearing through a forest. He didn't just win, he finished people. He didn't just score points, he silenced opponents. In the semifinals, he dismantled a formidable fighter in 19 seconds flat. The final blow, a roundhouse kick, was so loud, so concussive, that the people in the front rows felt the air pressure change before their eyes could even register the movement. When that kick landed, the arena didn't erupt in cheers. It went quiet. It was the kind of silence that happens when a crowd realizes that the person in front of them is capable of doing real, lasting damage, and they aren't sure if they should be applauding or calling for help. The final match against a tough Californian practitioner lasted less than 2 minutes. It ended with a knockout that was clinical, brutal, and efficient. And then the bell rang. This was the moment. The moment where the script of the evening should have been followed, where the rules of decorum were supposed to hold the chaos at bay. The tournament director, Ed Parker, walked out to present the trophy, a massive, shining edifice of chrome and walnut. It was a gesture of respect, a conclusion to the ritual. The winner was supposed to bow, take the hardware, show it to the cameras, and exit the stage so the rest of the night could proceed. But this young man didn't bow. He didn't look at the trophy. He didn't leave the mat. Instead, he walked past the director, reached out and snatched the microphone from the announcer's stand. The air in the arena shifted instantly. 3,000 people sensed it at the exact same time, the violation of the unspoken law. You don't take the mic. You don't seize the spotlight when it's not yours. The room went unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. He stood there, holding the trophy in one hand and the microphone in the other, and he began to speak. At first, it sounded like a victory speech. He thanked the hosts. He thanked the Swedish Federation. He did the polite thing for about 45 seconds. But then, the tone turned sharp. He started talking about the difference between the dancing he had seen in American point karate, where a tap on the chest stopped the fight, and the real fighting he was used to back in Europe. He talked about full contact, about real punches, about the difference between performance and reality. The crowd began to murmur. It wasn't a roar, just a nervous ripple of conversation. They knew exactly where this was going, and it made them uncomfortable. They watched as the young champion kept talking, his voice dripping with the confidence of someone who has never been told no. He started mentioning Chinese kung fu. He mocked the idea of it being a complete system. He mentioned he had been watching a certain television show, and he dismissed it as Hollywood flash. He called it fake. He called it a performance. That was his power. And it was that very power, that quiet, unbothered confidence, that was about to drive his challenger to the edge. The storm was coming, brought in by a young man who was undefeated, arrogant, and hungry. But for this brief, frozen moment, all we had was the stillness of the third row and the mounting, suffocating weight of 3,000 people, waiting for a bell that would change everything. The setup was perfect, the stage was set, and the quiet was about to be shattered in a way that would echo for decades. Arrogance in the face of greatness. The silence of the arena didn't last. It was torn apart by the arrival of a force that seemed entirely too big for the room. While Bruce sat in the third row, calm and contained, the focus of the arena shifted violently toward the center of the mat. Out walked the man who would define the chaos. He was 22 years old, standing at a towering 6'5", and weighing in at a solid 245 pounds of pure, unchecked momentum. He was the reigning European champion, a product of the full-contact world, and from the moment he stepped onto the floor, he carried an air of absolute, unearned certainty. This young man wasn't just here to win a trophy. He was here to validate a worldview. He had been trained since he was 13 and lifting since he was 15, built like a fortress that had never been tested by anything it couldn't simply crush. When you are that young, that strong, and that undefeated, you tend to develop a dangerous blind spot. You begin to believe that your strength is the only truth, that if something doesn't bow to your power, it must be flawed. He didn't know that he was about to collide with a version of reality he hadn't even imagined existed. The tournament bracket had been his playground all day. He moved through the competition not like a participant, but like a storm tearing through a forest. He didn't just win, he finished people. He didn't just score points, he silenced opponents. In the semifinals, he dismantled a formidable fighter in 19 seconds flat. The final blow, a roundhouse kick, was so loud, so concussive, that the people in the front rows felt the air pressure change before their eyes could even register the movement. When that kick landed, the arena didn't erupt in cheers. It went quiet. It was the kind of silence that happens when a crowd realizes that the person in front of them is capable of doing real, lasting damage, and they aren't sure if they should be applauding or calling for help. The final match against a tough Californian practitioner lasted less than 2 minutes. It ended with a knockout that was clinical, brutal, and efficient. And then the bell rang. This was the moment. The moment where the script of the evening should have been followed, where the rules of decorum were supposed to hold the chaos at bay. The tournament director, Ed Parker, walked out to present the trophy, a massive, shining edifice of chrome and walnut. It was a gesture of respect, a conclusion to the ritual. The winner was supposed to bow, take the hardware, show it to the cameras, and exit the stage so the rest of the night could proceed. But this young man didn't bow. He didn't look at the trophy. He didn't leave the mat. Instead, he walked past the director, reached out and snatched the microphone from the announcer's stand. The air in the arena shifted instantly. 3,000 people sensed it at the exact same time, the violation of the unspoken law. You don't take the mic. You don't seize the spotlight when it's not yours. The room went unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. He stood there, holding the trophy in one hand and the microphone in the other, and he began to speak. At first, it sounded like a victory speech. He thanked the hosts. He thanked the Swedish Federation. He did the polite thing for about 45 seconds. But then, the tone turned sharp. He started talking about the difference between the dancing he had seen in American point karate, where a tap on the chest stopped the fight, and the real fighting he was used to back in Europe. He talked about full contact, about real punches, about the difference between performance and reality. The crowd began to murmur. It wasn't a roar, just a nervous ripple of conversation. They knew exactly where this was going, and it made them uncomfortable. They watched as the young champion kept talking, his voice dripping with the confidence of someone who has never been told no. He started mentioning Chinese kung fu. He mocked the idea of it being a complete system. He mentioned he had been watching a certain television show, and he dismissed it as Hollywood flash. He called it fake. He called it a performance. Then he turned. He didn't need to scan the room. He had been staring at the third row since the moment he walked out for the finals. He looked directly at the man in the dark jacket. He pointed a finger, and with the full weight of his arrogance, he issued the challenge. Bruce Lee, you are here. I am here. He laid it out, clear as day. I am 22. I am the champion. I have the trophy. 1 round is too much for you. I will give you 3 minutes. The arena erupted, but not in a way you would expect. It wasn't the cheering of a crowd watching a spectacle. It was a collective, sharp intake of breath. 3,000 people realized, in that single frozen instant, that the night had stopped being a tournament. It had stopped being a sporting event. It had become something else entirely. A confrontation. They were about to see if the man in the third row was a real fighter, or just an actor, and they were terrified of finding out the answer. The young challenger stood there, panting slightly, still riding the adrenaline of his win, looking down at the man in the chair with a mix of disdain and hunger. He was so sure of his victory. He was so sure that his size, his record, and his brute force were all he needed. He had no idea that he was currently standing on the edge of a cliff, and that the man he was calling out wasn't just a martial artist, he was a force of nature. The young man thought he was inviting a fight. In reality, he was inviting a lesson. And as the arena held its breath, waiting for Bruce to move, the arrogance of the challenger hung in the air, loud and undeniable, setting the stage for the most one-sided, eye-opening encounter the martial arts world would ever know. The trap was set, not by Bruce, but by the young man's own ego. He was about to learn that you don't call out a master unless you are prepared to have your entire worldview dismantled in front of 3,000 witnesses. The atmosphere in the Long Beach arena didn't just change when the challenge was issued, it curdled. The air became thick, almost impossible to breathe. 3,000 people, who had come for a tournament, were now suffocating under the weight of a sudden, brutal reality check. The young champion stood there in the center of the mat, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the third row, waiting for the explosion of panic or refusal. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see the man in the dark jacket squirm, to see him look away, or perhaps to see him make excuses. That is what people do when their pride is cornered. But Bruce Lee did none of these things. He didn't lean back. He didn't whisper with his neighbors in a panic. He didn't look for an exit. For anyone who had known Bruce, or even just studied the way he carried himself, this lack of reaction was the most terrifying part. He had been through this before. Not always on a stage this grand, but in the dark, dusty corners of Los Angeles martial arts schools, in the back rooms of gyms, and in the quiet, tense conversations between men who had trained for 20 years versus men who had trained for 2. He knew the pattern by heart. It was the same old story. Someone young, fueled by adrenaline and the false god of full contact, feeling the desperate, clawing need to prove that they were the biggest fish in the pond. It was a human tendency as old as conflict itself. It wasn't about fighting. It was about the ego trying to survive the mirror. Bruce leaned over to the man sitting beside him. He didn't look flustered. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man watching a leaf fall from a tree, something completely natural, something entirely expected. He spoke a single sentence, quiet enough that the microphone didn't pick it up, quiet enough that only the man next to him heard it. "He has already lost," Bruce said. "He just doesn't know it yet." Then he stood up. The moment he rose, the arena noise did something strange. It rose, a crescendo of murmurs and gasps that hit the ceiling, and then, as he began to walk toward the mat, it dropped into an absolute, vacuum-sealed silence. It was the kind of silence you only find when people are afraid that a single cough or whisper might break the spell of the history they are witnessing. Bruce walked with a rhythm that felt disconnected from the panic around him. He didn't rush. He didn't skip. He navigated the steps of the third row with the grace of someone walking through his own living room. He reached the low barrier that separated the seating area from the mats. He didn't climb over it with the frantic energy of a brawler. He stepped over it, his movements fluid, calculated, and terrifyingly precise. He was still wearing his dark jacket. He wasn't in a gi. He didn't have a colored belt to signal his rank to the room. He didn't have a weapon, a mouthpiece, or a corner team to pat him on the back. He looked, to the untrained eye, like an ordinary man who had just decided to go for a walk. But the 3,000 people in that room were no longer untrained. They were watching him, and they were beginning to understand that the man in the black trousers was the most dangerous person in the building. He reached the edge of the mat and stopped. He looked at the floor, then at the challenger. Still, he said nothing. He didn't need to bark a rebuttal. He didn't need to insult the man who had just insulted him. He reached up and unbuttoned his jacket. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost maddeningly so. He folded the jacket once, neatly, as if he were placing it on a chair in a quiet office, and laid it on the barrier. Underneath, he wore a black training top. He kicked off his shoes, the casual streetwear shoes of a civilian, and set them perfectly straight beside the jacket. He was barefoot now, his feet meeting the canvas, his toes gripping the mat. He walked to the center of the floor. He stopped about 8 feet away from the young giant. The height difference was laughable. 7 inches of pure, muscle-bound ego towering over a man who looked, in comparison, like a wisp of smoke. The challenger was vibrating with aggression, his fists balled, his breathing heavy. Bruce, on the other hand, was standing with his hands open at his sides. He wasn't guarding, he wasn't posturing, he was just standing there. This, the crowd realized, was the weight. It wasn't theatrical. He wasn't posing for the cameras or trying to intimidate the challenger with a tough guy glare. He was simply waiting for the next thing to happen. It was the patience of a predator, or perhaps the patience of a teacher, waiting for a child to stop crying so the lesson could begin. It was the most honest moment in the history of that arena. Everyone there, from the front row to the very back, understood without being told that the man who looked smaller was, in every dimension that mattered, the larger figure on the mat. He wasn't standing there to fight. He was standing there to provide an answer. Ed Parker, the man who had been running the tournament, realized that the situation had crossed a line. You can't issue a challenge like that in front of 3,000 people and have it ignored. The air was too tight, the expectation too high. He stepped to the microphone, his voice tight, his face mirroring the unease of everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," Parker announced, the words vibrating through the speakers. "Unscheduled exhibition. 3 minutes, 1 round, full contact." He paused, looking between them. He could feel the disparity. Dolph Lundgren, European Kyokushin champion, versus Bruce Lee. The crowd noise didn't just return, it exploded, doubling in intensity. It was the sound of a lid being blown off a pressure cooker. But as the roar washed over them, Bruce didn't blink. He waited for the signal. He was in the zone, in that strange, silent and terrifying space where the world shrinks down to the distance between two souls. He was ready. And as Parker raised his hand to start the clock, the young challenger stepped forward, ready to unleash everything he had, unaware that he was stepping directly into a lesson that would dismantle everything he thought he knew about himself. Ed Parker raised his hand, the air in the arena snapping tight, and he said it. Fight. The word hadn't even finished vibrating in the air before the challenger moved. It was a blur of motion, a testament to the raw, unrefined power that had carried him to the top of the European circuit. Dolph came forward with the explosive, linear aggression of a Kyokushin fighter. He launched a front kick, a devastating, piston-like strike with his full body weight committed to the impact. The exact same strike that had ended his semi-final match in under 20 seconds. He was looking for a knockout, a highlight reel finish to validate his ego. But when his foot reached the space where a man was supposed to be, there was nothing but air. Bruce wasn't there. He had shifted. It was an angle, a 45-degree movement that looked, from the stands, as if he had simply vanished and reappeared a heartbeat later. He didn't scramble, and he didn't panic. He had moved inside the kicking range before Dolph's foot had even reached its target. His right hand was chambered, a potential lightning strike loaded and ready, but he didn't fire it. He just reset. He stood there, completely unbothered, while the challenger's momentum carried him forward into empty space. The next 90 seconds were a masterclass in the difference between fighting with force and fighting with understanding. Dolph was hunting. He was throwing everything he had, the lead leg roundhouse, the spinning back kick, the classic punch-punch low kick combination that had shattered his previous opponents. He was a machine, running through his entire library of techniques, searching for a way to land, searching for a way to connect. And yet he couldn't find a foothold. Bruce was like water, slipping around him. He checked the low kicks with a subtle rotation of his shins, never stepping back, never losing his ground. He slipped the punches by millimeters, moving his shoulders just enough to let the wind of the strikes pass harmlessly by his ears. He didn't throw a single strike in return. He was simply reading. By the 90-second mark, the audience's confusion had shifted into a deep, heavy silence. They were no longer seeing a contest. They were watching something they couldn't quite name. They saw a smaller, lighter man, a man in black trousers and no padding, turning the European champion into a ghost. It looked as if Dolph were fighting underwater, his movements becoming increasingly desperate and heavy, while Bruce moved with the lightness of thought. The people in the front row, the experienced fighters, the men who had spent their lives in dojos, were the first to catch on. They stopped taking notes. They sat with their pens forgotten, their jaws tight. They were witnessing a conversation between two different worlds. A fight, they knew, is just a negotiation about distance. Every martial art on earth makes an assumption about where a fight should happen. Kyokushin assumes you want to be close enough for the knees, the elbows, the full-body power shots to the chest. But Bruce had spent 15 years of his life mastering the gap. He lived in the space exactly half a step outside the range where others felt comfortable. It was a zone that required absolute spatial awareness, a geometry of combat where he could reach across the gap before anyone else could close it. He was demonstrating that you don't need size when you own the geometry of the situation. He was proving that while Dolph had mastered the technique of fighting, he had yet to understand the map upon which all fighting occurs. Technique is what you do when you're standing in the right spot. Geometry is the art of always being in the right spot, before your opponent even knows where you are. 2 minutes in, the frustration on the challenger's face was palpable. He committed to a heavy, left-leg roundhouse, a strike meant to end the fight. It was a desperate, powerful swing. Bruce didn't duck or shy away. He stepped into the danger. He reached out with his left hand, caught the ankle in mid-air, and simultaneously delivered a sharp, controlled sidekick to the back of the challenger's planted knee. The result was instantaneous. The sheer physics of the movement, a redistribution of weight at the perfect angle, sent 245 pounds of muscle crashing onto the canvas. The sound of the impact echoed through the hall, a dull, heavy thud that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Dolph went down hard. For a second, the arena was completely still. Then, he scrambled back up, his face flushed with the embarrassment of being exposed in front of 3,000 people. He came forward again, angrier now, his technique beginning to fray around the edges. He threw a right cross. Bruce slipped it. He followed with a left hook. Bruce slipped it, his eyes tracking every flicker of movement. Then came a knee, a desperate, lunging attempt at contact. Bruce met it with a knee of his own, a clean, sharp check. The sound of the two knees colliding in the air was the loudest thing in the room, a sharp, clear crack that signaled a total mismatch in timing. Dolph staggered back. He looked disoriented, not because he was hurt, but because he was witnessing the impossible. He was encountering a reality that made his years of training seem like a collection of broken tools. He was being educated, slowly and methodically, in front of the entire world. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Bruce had still not thrown a real punch. He had simply been dismantling the man in front of him, layer by layer, ego by ego. And then, he threw it. The right hand. It wasn't a wild, swinging haymaker. It was a straight, clean shot, an expression of perfect alignment. He pulled the punch at the last millisecond, the knuckles landing on the challenger's chest with the force of a firm, corrective push. But it wasn't the punch that did the work. It was the momentum. Dolph was already lunging, his own weight committing to a step that Bruce had read a second before it happened. The contact, subtle as it was, acted like a fulcrum. It redirected all of that forward, aggressive energy, and at that specific, impossible angle, the challenger's center of gravity had no choice but to fold. He went down on one knee. He didn't fall because of the pain. He fell because the geometry had dictated it. He stayed there for a beat, looking up, grounded by his own weight and the undeniable truth of the situation. Bruce didn't gloat. He didn't pose. He had already turned halfway around, walking back to the center of the mat, his job finished, the point proven. He was done with the fight before the bell had even rung. The audience, still reeling, watched in absolute stunned silence. They had come to watch a brawl, but they had been shown a lecture. They were witnessing a man who had mastered the silence, the space, and the truth of combat. And in that realization, the entire atmosphere of the arena shifted from anticipation to a kind of quiet, collective reverence. They were watching a master at work, and they knew, in their bones, that they were seeing something they would never, ever see again. The bell rang. 3 minutes. The clock had run its course, but the echo of what had transpired was just beginning to find its rhythm. Bruce didn't stand over the man on the floor like a conqueror. He didn't puff his chest or celebrate. He stayed in that state of quiet, grounded presence. As the sound of the bell faded, he turned back, extended his hand, and pulled the young giant to his feet. They stood there, facing each other in the center of that mat, the silence of 3,000 people pressing in on them from all sides. It wasn't the silence of a crowd waiting for a decision. It was the hush of a congregation that had just witnessed a sermon without a single word being preached. Bruce leaned in. He spoke quietly, his voice a steady, calm hum that reached only the ears of the referee and the man who had just been dismantled. The referee would later say that the words were meant for one person only, a private conversation held in the middle of a public arena. We know now, years later, through the reflection of the man who stood on the receiving end of that wisdom, what the core of it was. Bruce didn't gloat. He didn't offer a critique of the challenger's technique or mock his failures. He validated him. He looked at the young champion and said, in effect, that he already knew how to fight. He acknowledged that the years of training, the blood, and the effort were all there, visible in every move the young man made. But he pointed to the one thing that was missing, the shift from performing to seeing. He told him that the day he stopped trying to impress the man standing across from him and started simply watching him, really seeing what was there, was the day he would truly arrive. It was a lesson wrapped in empathy. He didn't break the young man, he opened a door for him. Bruce nodded once, a final, sharp gesture, and walked away. He picked up his jacket, gathered his shoes, and strolled off the mat in his bare feet. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for the applause, though it came, a rolling wave of it. But this wasn't the cheering for a victor in a tournament. It was the applause of people who had just realized they weren't watching a fighter anymore. They were watching a teacher. It was the sound of 3,000 people being humbled by a moment of clarity. As he disappeared into the corridor, the noise continued, a slow, sustained roar of recognition. He was gone before the crowd had even finished processing what they had just seen. There was no press conference, no interviews, no post-fight showboating. Bruce walked out to his car, drove home in the silence of the evening, and left the event behind, as if it were nothing more than a passing cloud. The next morning, the local papers gave it a few scant lines, filling the space with errors and misunderstandings, proving that those who weren't there couldn't possibly grasp what had occurred. But the story didn't need the papers. It traveled the way real, vital knowledge always travels, through the veins of the community. It moved from dojo to dojo, whispered over phone lines between black belts, carried in the memories of those who had been in the front row. It became the legend of the Saturday afternoon that changed everything. The young challenger Dolph went back to Stockholm. But the man who returned was not the same one who had left for America. He kept competing, but the fire of his ego had been tempered. He moved through life in a way that would have been impossible for the boy who had once demanded a challenge to prove his worth. He went on to study chemical engineering at MIT on a Fulbright scholarship. He became an icon, finding his place in the world of film, and eventually the world learned his name. Yet for years, he kept the memory of those 3 minutes in Long Beach locked away. When he finally spoke about it, he didn't call it a humiliation. He didn't call it a loss. He called it an education. He spoke of those 3 minutes as the most instructive, revealing, and valuable moments of his life. He admitted that the uncertainty he walked away with, the realization that his entire foundation was built on assumptions, was worth more than all the trophies he had ever collected. Bruce Lee never mentioned it. He lived by the principle that what happens in the circle stays in the circle. He didn't dwell on the past or seek to immortalize his victories. He remained focused on the now, on the next step, on the next movement. That consistency was his true legacy. It wasn't the flash of the kicks or the speed of the punches that made him. It was the quiet, terrifying consistency of his own character. What happened on that mat wasn't just a physical encounter. It was a mirror held up to 3,000 people. It was a reminder that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who possesses the truth. The younger man had walked on with a plan, a strategy, a set of beliefs about how the world worked. The older man had walked on with nothing but his awareness, and the entire crushing weight of that encounter was contained in that single, simple difference. Decades later, the story still feels fresh because it speaks to the fundamental human condition. We all walk onto our own mats every day, at work, in our relationships, in the mirror. We all carry our armor, our techniques, our certainty that we know how this is going to go. We all want to be the one who controls the outcome. But life, like that 3-minute exhibition, has a way of showing us that our plan is only as good as our ability to see what is actually in front of us. The 3,000 people who were there went home that night and told their families about the man in the dark jacket. The story shifted as it moved, growing grander and more mythic with every telling, but the core remained untouched. A teacher had stepped out of the crowd to show a student that the biggest obstacle in a fight isn't the opponent, it's the story you've already written in your head. The mat had said everything it needed to say. It had dismantled an ego, built up a soul, and left a quiet, lingering truth in the air. The exhibition lasted 3 minutes, but it was a lifetime of learning packed into 180 seconds. It changed the life of the man who lost, it defined the man who won, and it left the rest of us with a lesson that never gets old. Stay present, stay open, and remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to fight the world, but to truly, deeply see it. The storm had passed. The arena was empty. But for everyone who had been there, the world looked a little different, the air a little clearer, and the path forward a little more honest. And really, isn't that what we're all looking for? Not just a win, but a way to see. That was the legacy of those 3 minutes. That was the story of the day the dragon didn't roar, but simply breathed, and in doing so taught us how to be human.